this through.
Let's suppose that political leaders remain dilatory or resistant. What happens?
If they cannot address this in a credible way, I believe within perhaps 2 to 3 weeks we will have a meltdown in sovereign debt, which will produce a meltdown across the European banking system. We're not just talking about a relatively small Belgian bank. We're talking about the largest banks in the world, the largest banks in Germany, the largest banks in France. That will spread. It will spread to the United Kingdom, in part through sovereign debt problems in Ireland. It will spread everywhere because the global financial system is so interconnected. They are each all those banks are counterparties to every significant bank in the United States and in Britain and in Japan and around the world. This would be a crisis that would be, in my view, more serious than the crisis in 2008.
Lord, is he exaggerating, Lord Minus?
I wish I could give a more cheerful complexion, but we're on the verge of a perfect storm. A number of European countries cannot raise money. Banks are therefore increasingly worried about the default. Therefore, people won't lend money to banks, and therefore banks won't lend money to business. So something has to be done, and has to be done substantially across the whole of Europe. If you do it individually, country by country, you should simply shift the focus from one country or one bank to another. That's why in October 2008 we obliged all the major UK banks to increase their capitalisation.
We're often accused, journalists, of being apocalyptic, but this is an apocalypse, isn't it? I mean, what happened to the spirit of the G20? What needs to happen right now, Lord Minus?
Very significant agreement across Europe to recapitalise the banks. This problem can be solved, Jeremy. It's within the wit of man to do it, but it requires the political will of Europe's leaders to agree a programme as soon as possible.
And thus far we haven't seen it, have we?
No, I mean, they're talking in more urgent terms about the plan for the plan, but we haven't got the plan yet, and we need to get that now.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
We really need two things. We need not only to recapitalize the banks, even more crucially, we have to come up with a credible plan to preserve the stability of the sovereign debt of Italy and Spain.
Listen to the words he'd say, but in his voice I heard decay. The plastic face forced to portray all the insides left cold and gray. A place that still remains. It eats the fear, it eats the pain. The sweetest price you'll have to pay. The day the whole world went away.
I am a specialist in looking at the risks to the markets and the portfolio that we cannot quantify, politics, policy, geopolitics in particular. And I spent a lot of my time with policymakers and some of the world's biggest investors, trying to hear where the gaps are in the understanding of what's likely to happen, because perception gaps, when they close, they create price movements, and my job is to try to identify where those are going to happen. Well, I think we're going to have sovereign defaults. I don't think it's avoidable. And that's been my view since the beginning of this financial crisis. I think it's clear what we did is we took the losses that were in the banking system and we moved them off the bank balance sheets and onto the government's balance sheet. But this doesn't diminish the loss. It still has to be paid for. What's happening is people are beginning to understand that the first round of austerity, which we're experiencing here in the UK, that the Irish engaged in some months back, is only round one. And eventually, it becomes clear to the political leadership that the cost of defaulting is lower than the cost of paying. And so therefore, my bottom line is not only will we get default, but we should buy when the default is announced. Most people will do the opposite. They will see default and they'll get scared and they'll want to sell everything in their portfolio. My view is once you default, it's like hitting the reset button on your computer. It clears the decks, you start again, and now you can grow. Most central banks are very nervous about deflation. So how can I argue inflation is a risk? Well, partly because we're seeing it start to jump in very specific things. So for example, Levi Strauss announced that in reaction to the record high price for cotton, which is a function of banks are not lending to farmers, so farmers are not planting, in conjunction with the Bangladeshi textile worker settlement, the price of blue jeans is going to go up. Lord Wolfson here in the UK, who's the chairman of Next, has repeatedly been talking about they're going to have to pass on an 8% higher cost of goods to their customers in this coming year. That will be the first set of price hikes in textiles since about 1985-86. After years of declining prices, we get an 8% jump in one announcement. This is big. The way to watch for inflation, in my opinion, is not the data point. Don't watch the CPI. That's not going to help you very much. The thing you want to watch for is literally the size of candy bars. They get smaller. It's already started. Walmart recently reduced the size of its sort of core coffee can from 39 ounces to 33 ounces. It used to specify where the coffee came from. Now it says premium. This is a way of charging you the same amount of money for less and a lower quality product. That's inflation. And so that's why I think this emerging market inflation pressure is important for us to keep an eye on in the West. And it has huge implications for all of our portfolios, for the performance of equities, for the performance of bonds. Makes me really interested in owning brands, strong brands that can pass on those higher input costs. And it makes me think through what my assumptions are about the future in a way that I might not if I weren't paying attention to that set of pressures. This food inflation begins to create geopolitical risks, as in country risk. And we will see some governments destabilized as the population is hit by much higher food prices. Different countries will be in different positions to be able to handle that pressure. So that's one form of geopolitics that I think we ought to keep an eye out for. Another form is that as the price of energy, raw materials, and food goes up, governments now have a much stronger interest in controlling, owning those assets. So we're going to see countries contesting for ownership of these assets more and more. This is one of the things we're witnessing in Asia at the moment, where the Chinese are claiming the open ocean territory that's above the gas fields as pretty much their own. Other countries say, excuse me, that's disputed territory and I think it really belongs to me. So they are reaching harder than they were for those assets. And that leads to disputes. That leads to the US and China at times being quite nose to nose in a kind of a military chicken that's going on.